All right, thank you, worship team, for leading us in worship this morning. I am Pastor Josh. I want to just thank each and every one of you for joining us today. It's so great to have you be here, and we look forward to just a fun day together, a good day together. And as Pastor Steve mentioned earlier, we want you guys to stick around after the service. We have a lot of great food, a lot of things. We'll give instructions then. This week, our VBS was called Brave, and you can see it was kind of patterned off the idea of the Olympics. And I've watched some of the Olympics this week. Has anybody else seen any Olympics? Like, you caught at least 2 seconds of something? All right, many of us in the room have seen some of the Olympics, or maybe in years past, maybe you didn't watch this year. But one of the things that always just kind of blows my mind are the high divers. All right, the people that go way, way high, they're like 30 feet up, I think, approximately, something in that range. I don't know, it's super high. It's kind of like about the height of this room. And for whatever reason, they think it's a good idea to just jump off out into space and to fall all the way down into the pool. But they do it incredibly gracefully. It looks so amazing, so easy for them to do it. A number of years ago, quite a few years ago actually, I had the opportunity to go to Mexico. Has anybody ever been to Mexico? Anybody? A few of you? All right. And as part of being in Mexico, I got to go with my wife Melanie, and the two of us. We were actually on our honeymoon, so it was a long, long time ago. But we went to a cenote. It's a place where there's like this hole in the ground, and at the bottom of the hole is a big pool of water that goes really deep. But from the top of the ground, which when you look out, you're standing there, you look out, it just, it's flat, but you see kind of a little hole. When you walk over to it, you can't get too close, you realize that it's like 90 feet down. And apparently some indigenous people used to like dive off of that, like 90 feet, or jump off of it. We walked down those stairs, down into the bottom, and it got kind of dark and kind of cool, and we get down into the bottom, and then we started walking up a few stairs, and I realized they were having the entire group walk up to a platform to jump into the cenote. Now, for many people, they were excited about this. I was not, because many of you know this, I do not like heights. I get nervous with heights very, very easily, very quickly. Even I can watch like a YouTube video, and if somebody's like on a tower, like hanging out or something, like my heart is racing. Even though I'm sitting in a chair in my house, my heart is pounding. That's how kind of nervous I am. And all of a sudden I realized, like, we're going to have to jump off this into the water. Now, it wasn't like 30 feet high, but I think it was about 20, like 15 to 20 feet. And my heart was pounding, and I thought, I can't do this. And I wanted to turn around and go back. But do you know what made me do it? I didn't want others to laugh at me for being chicken and not to do it. All right, I have to be honest. I didn't want others, all the other, there were like kids jumping off of it, and here I am as an adult, a 20-some-year-old guy about to chicken out. And so the peer pressure of knowing that people would have been mocking me, maybe not out loud, but internally they would have been laughing and mocking me, that kind of pushed me to go ahead and do something that I didn't really want to do. Well, I don't know if you've ever experienced that, where you felt the pressure to do something that you didn't want to do, or feel the pressure to do something that you know to be wrong. Today, we're going to look at a story for a few minutes of some individuals who were pressured into doing something that they knew was wrong. In Daniel chapter 3, we find the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, some of you may be familiar with those names. Some of you, maybe it's the first time you've ever heard those names. So in the Bible, in the book of Daniel, which was named after a man named Daniel, there was really Daniel and then 3 other Hebrews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as they were known in Babylon. They had been captured by the Babylonian army, and they had been taken out of their country. Can you imagine that, being taken out of your country? And they were taken to a foreign country, and they were captives there. But because they were young, the King Nebuchadnezzar, thought, you know what, we can raise them, we can train them, and they can become good Babylonians. And so that's what they tried to do. They changed their names to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and that's how we know them. And they taught them everything about Babylon and their religion and all of those things. But through the course of all of that, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they stayed true to their God, the God that we worship, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But there came this point in time, And we're not sure where Daniel was. He must have been away on a business trip or something. He wasn't there at that point in time. But the king was very prideful. The king was really full of himself. The king really thought very highly of himself. And do you know what he did? He built a statue. It was made out of gold. And it was the biggest statue you've probably ever seen. Do you think the statue was this tall? No, it was taller. Do you think it was as tall as this room? Nope, that's right. It was even taller. I think this room is maybe roughly, we'll call it 30 feet, approximately. The statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had built of himself was 90 feet tall. So just look up, right into the lights. Blind yourself real quick. So you kind of see the peak there. You might have think 3 times higher than that. 90 feet tall. And it was 9 feet wide, which is not quite as wide as the top of this platform, but it's pretty close. That is a huge, huge statue. You could have seen it from miles around. And it was made of gold. Now, the math person in me wants to calculate how valuable that would have been. Like, wow, super valuable. That's a lot of gold. But what King Nebuchadnezzar did was he wanted everybody to show their allegiance to him as the king. And in fact, in their culture, he thought of himself as a god. He thought he was above everybody else. And so he wanted everybody to show their allegiance to him. He wanted everybody to worship him. So they got lots of musicians together. They got a band together, all kinds of different instruments. And they called everybody that was anywhere near that location to come out and stand before that giant statue. And they proclaimed that when the music started playing, instead of just singing like we did a few minutes ago, do you know what everybody was supposed to do? They were supposed to bow down in front of the idol, in front of that statue of King Nebuchadnezzar, and worship him instead of worshiping God. And so they warned everybody, if you don't do that, there'll be a consequence. And so I can imagine the pressure that was there. I don't know if you've ever experienced peer pressure. Has anybody in the room ever experienced any peer pressure? A few people? All right? I think we've all experienced peer pressure at one point or another in our lives, and it can be quite intense, can't it? It can be really intense. And so here are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They know they can't do that. They know it goes against everything that they've been trained, everything they've been taught, everything the scriptures tell them, that they only worship one God. They can worship no other God. They can't bow down to a human being or a statue of a human being. And so the music plays, and it says everybody bowed down, although the scripture kind of leaves out for a moment. It just says everybody bows down. And for a second, you think, oh no, did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, did they cave to the peer pressure? Did they bow down? But then it talks about there was a group of people who were watching, and they noticed that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had not bowed down. And so do you know what they did? They were snitches. They go over to where the king is, and they come before the king, and they kind of start saying, King, you're so wonderful and everything, but do you know what? Everybody bowed down. Everybody in your kingdom bowed down, except for these 3 over here. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're part of your officials even. They're not even common people. They're part of your officials, and they didn't bow down. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar was so full of himself, he got upset. And so he called the 3 young men, and many people think that they might have still been teenagers, possibly. They come before King Nebuchadnezzar, and he basically says to them, do you not know who I am? Do you not know that I have control over you, over your lives? I can do anything. If I just say something, that's what's going to happen. And the young men, they say they understand that. But they said, King, we can't bow down. We can only worship our God. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, that gets him angry. He gets enraged. And he warns them, if they don't bow down, there's going to be major consequences. Now, I can't imagine this. I've never seen anything like it, and it's kind of scary. I mean, it's very, very scary. We're not talking about like getting grounded for a week. We're not talking about losing iPad privileges. We're not talking about that type of consequence. The king warns them they will lose their lives if they do not bow down. I mean, there's no more serious of a consequence, is there, than to be threatened with your very life. And it would be in a terrible way. To make the golden statue, Do you know what they had to build to make the golden statue? They had to have these huge hot furnaces to be able to melt gold and to form it. And so the king said, if you don't bow down, I'm going to have you thrown into those hot furnaces and you will die. So what happens? Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego basically say to him, King, we understand, but we can't bow down. We can't do it. Even though they felt the peer pressure, they said, we can't do it. And then they said something that's really amazing. They said, our God has the power to save us. That's an amazing statement, isn't it? Somebody's threatening their life, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, our God has the power to save us. Now, I think the next statement, though, might be even more incredible what they say. They say, but even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down. To me, that is the most incredible statement. Do you see the faith that they had in God? They said, we're going to do the right thing no matter what it costs us. It doesn't matter. Maybe our God will save us, and we know he can, but maybe he won't. But either way, we're going to do the right thing. Now, if I were them, I think I would be very afraid, kind of almost maybe even shaking, and I suspect they were afraid too. But do you know, being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. Brave means doing the right thing even when you are afraid to do it. And so they play the music again. Everybody bows down except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They said they weren't going to bow down. And even with all that peer pressure, even with being warned that they would be killed, they still did not bow down. And so the king now is furious. In fact, he's so angry, the Bible says his face kind of distorts. Like he gets that really angry. Kids, can you give me a really angry face? Like really, yeah. All right. Have you ever been so angry, or have you ever seen your parents so angry that their face kind of changes a little bit? All right. That's probably happened to all of us. My children have two hands up for some reason. I don't understand that. The king was so angry. He said, you know what? A hot furnace isn't even good enough for them. Heat it 7 times hotter than it's ever been heated. And it gets so blazing hot, he tells them, bind them, put them in ropes, handcuffs, and throw them into the furnace. It was so hot when the soldiers that took them and threw them in the furnace, it was so hot those soldiers immediately died. But do you know what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? It was something we could maybe never have expected. Something in our human experience we wouldn't believe is possible. But you know how they said our God has the power to save us? And they did say even if he doesn't, we still won't bow down. But our God has the power to save us. And in that moment, the king looks into the furnace. And as he looks into the furnace, he's like, I don't understand it. Wait, didn't we throw 3 men into the fire? And all of his officials said, yeah, there were 3 men. They were bound. We saw it. The 3 men were thrown in. He's like, there are 4 individuals in that fire. Who is the 4th? So the king cries out and yells to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out. And they come over, and only 3 of them come out. The 4th one vanishes. Do you know who that 4th one was? Right, we understand it as Jesus. We understand that the 4th person in the fire that day was, in a sense, God himself with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You see, we can be brave to do the right thing because God will always be with us. Sometimes doing the right thing is really, really hard. Sometimes it's really, really difficult. Can you not attest to that? As I was thinking about that in my life, I remember as a child one time being pressured to do something wrong. I was in church, and I was in a classroom, and I was with other kids. I was about 11 years old, maybe 12, 11, 12. And there was a group of us, about a dozen or so in that room. And I don't know, I think the teacher for some reason had to leave the classroom. Whatever reason, I don't think the teacher was there in that moment. But some of the boys in the class started making fun of another boy in the class. And I still remember that boy's name. His name was Paul. And the other boys began to make fun of that boy. And I felt the pressure of them looking at me like, hey, you need to make fun of him too. And isn't it weird when you feel that peer pressure, you have that moment of do I give in to it? Do I do the wrong thing or do I do the right thing? And in that moment, I was afraid. In that moment, I wasn't very brave. I was more worried about what the other boys in the class who were making fun of Paul, what they would say about me if I didn't join in. And I'm sad to say, I joined in. I started mocking Paul along with those other boys. And it was over something stupid. It didn't matter at all. And yet, in that moment, it was terrible. And I know it hurt that boy. And here, almost 30 years later, I can still remember that event because I did the wrong thing in that moment. I remember we were mocking him because his pants came up too high. They weren't low enough. And we were mocking him about the way he dressed. It wasn't his fault that he had grown. About 12 years old, boys start to grow a lot of times. He had grown. His parents didn't have the opportunity or maybe even didn't have the money necessarily to buy new clothes right away. And so all kinds of things were said, and I know it hurt him as he was singled out. Sometimes when we don't trust God, instead of being brave and doing the right thing, we give in to temptation, we give in to peer pressure, and we do the wrong thing. But I also remember another time in my life where instead of doing the wrong thing, I was able to do the right thing because of God's help. I don't know if anybody in this room was ever tempted to cheat on a test. I don't know if that ever happened to anybody else. Okay, like the entire youth group just raised their hands. So apparently I'm not the only one that was tempted to cheat on a test. I knew I was going to fail the test. And I wasn't in elementary school. I wasn't even in middle school. And I wasn't even in high school. I was in college. I was in college. I was afraid. No, I wasn't afraid. I knew I was going to fail the class, or fail the test, and I knew I was going to fail the class if I failed the test. And in that class, you were allowed to bring all of the notes that you hand wrote. You could write as many notes as you wanted, and you could bring all of them with you. But they had to be your handwritten notes. Well, somebody else in the classroom was afraid of failing. They got their hands on some notes from somebody from the prior, and they photocopied them. So it looked like they were on notebook paper, they were handwritten, and then they distributed them to anybody that would take them. So I took a copy. And I believe there were about 15 kids in the class that took a copy that day. Out of a class, it was a big class, I think it was like 30 or 35. I think it was like 12 to 15 kids had a copy of those notes. And what makes it even worse than simply cheating is it was in a religion class with religion majors. I mean, isn't that the most horrible thing possible? Religion majors cheating in religion classes. Terrible. And I remember struggling with it, knowing it was the wrong thing to do. And as I walked to class that day, knowing that without those notes, I was not passing that test and I was failing the class, as I walked into the room, God gave me the courage to say, you know what's more important than passing the test to get a good grade in this class? It's passing the test of doing the thing that is right instead of doing the thing that is wrong. And I remember as I walked in the door, there was a trash can there, and I threw them in the trash can. I walked to my desk, the test started, I put my name on the test, and I walked up front and gave it to the professor. And he just looked at me, and I was like, I was going to fail the class anyway. And I walked out, having failed the class, yet feeling great about myself for having done, in that moment, the right thing instead. And I credit it to God being with me, speaking to me, and helping me have the courage to be brave, to do the right thing, even when it was difficult to do it. Kids, have you ever experienced a time where you were faced doing the right thing or the wrong thing? Adults, have you ever faced that in your lives? I think all of us have had those moments where we are tempted to do the wrong thing. We are scared to do the wrong thing, and we need God's presence to help us be brave and do the right thing, even when it's difficult. Sometimes doing the right thing is really hard. Sometimes doing the right thing is really hard. Sometimes it may mean that we get laughed at, or that somebody may mock us, or that somebody might reject us. Maybe we'll lose friends by doing the right thing. Adults, maybe you'll lose a promotion at work, or maybe you'll lose your job if you do the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing is really, really hard. But the message I want everybody to take away today from the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is that we can be brave to do the right thing because God is always with us. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew. They knew that God was with them, and they said, we know he has the power to save us, but even if he doesn't, we're going to do the right thing. Well, because they did the right thing, because they did not bow, and they were willing to suffer the consequences, something really incredible happened. And I want to read kind of the last part of it and then a verse that's really, really important. It says, then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. And even more than that, not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell like smoke. Now, that is an incredible thing. I don't know, have you ever been around a campfire? If you've ever spent any time around a campfire, you can be around it for like 30 seconds, and you will smell like the campfire. These men were in the fire, and yet they didn't even smell like they were near one. Now, I know how difficult that is. Over the last 24 hours, I had the opportunity or privilege to be able to smoke all of the pulled chicken that we're going to have today and most of the pulled pork. Nate helped me smoke some of the pork. So if the pork is good, that's because it was mine. No, I'm kidding. But what I can tell you is from just being around my smoker, do you know what my wife said? She's like, wow, you stink like smoke. From just being around the smoker for a little bit, these men didn't smell like it at all. Our worship team's going to come, and we're going to close with a song here in a moment. But there's one more verse that I want to read, and this is a really, really important one. This is really, really significant. It says, Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Do you see what happened? King Nebuchadnezzar, who wanted everybody to worship him, bowed down to him, his statue. Because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had courage, because they were brave and did the right thing, King Nebuchadnezzar realized who was truly the most powerful person, who was truly the real God. And he said, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You see, when we do the right thing, we point other people towards God when we're willing to do the right thing, even when it's hard. And we can do the right thing when it's hard because we know that God will be with us in every circumstance. Today we're going to close our time together with a song that the kids absolutely love, but I have to confess, it's a song that I have come to really love as well. If you're against praising God, if you're against excitedly praising God, you're going to hate this song. Hopefully, you allow yourself to kind of get into it and really do what the song says, is to praise him. It starts off, I'll praise in the valley, praise on the mountain. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you're in the fire. It doesn't matter if you're on the mountaintop. It doesn't matter where you are in life. It is always good, it is always right to give God praise. And when we do the right thing, even when it's hard, other people oftentimes will then give God praise as a result as well. And so I'm going to invite everybody, stand on your feet. We're going to end on a high note of celebrating and praising the God who was able to deliver Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fire. We invite you, if you know it, sing. Kids, if you want to come up and help lead and dance around, let's praise an amazing God this morning.